Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you here in person today, and good afternoon or evening or in other parts of the world for folks joining us virtually. My name is Charlotte Hebebrand, and on behalf of all of us at IFPRI, a very warm welcome to all of you to this very interesting seminar today. We are delighted to co-host today's discussion with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We have a truly extraordinary set of international trade experts with us today for a discussion on the role of trade in today's world, but also looking forward into the kinds of the possible worlds we may be living in the future and the role of trade in the future as well. We really want to hear from all of you during our Q&A session, so be thinking already about some of the questions and comments that you will want to make. There's a microphone in the room, and then if you're joining us virtually, you can submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jo Swinnen, Director General of IFPRI, who will set the scene for today, and then turn over to Marcus Noland from the Peterson Institute.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, for the introduction, and I think you summarized the essence already. This is a really extraordinary session here with not just the main speaker of today, but I think also our panel has very distinguished experts here, so it's going to be a great event. I would like to start by thanking the Peterson Institute to co-host this with us. It's a great pleasure for you to join us in this, to do this together, and of course also by several of the panel members from your institute. I understand that Mari Pangestu is online, will also join. It's an interesting moment for me because both my current board chair, Pascal Lamy, and my former board chair, who actually hired me, is on the panel today. So I'm interested for many reasons. I think the topic we are discussing today is very important for the world. It's also personally important for myself. I've done quite a lot of work on trade and value chains and their impacts over the course of my career. Clearly, it's a huge issue for the world. It affects income, food security, poverty, all kinds of things, human welfare. It's also the source of international conflict and vice versa. International conflicts and shocks have a major impact globally on trade and domestically as well, of course, regionally. Ukraine war is one of the recent examples with big disruptive effect. COVID-19 earlier had major impacts also on trade by the disruption of value chains. And what we often see is that these shocks are kind of reinforced by domestic politics when governments typically reinforce the shocks, the effect of the shock by putting in trade policies to protect often their home constituency, but then basically making it worse on global markets. There's quite a bit of work on IFPRI both historically and today, and so historically we'll certainly hear from people who've worked on this thing. But today, for example, our global models, measurement of shocks, trade impacts, we have whole series of tools now which are freely available on our websites. For example, the tracker of export restriction in food market, fertilizer markets, etc., I think have served an important role over the past couple of months and years. And on Africa, we work together with Academia 2063 for our annual Africa Trade Monitor report coming out. The world of trade and trade policies today is very different than it was when I did my PhD. Those days we were, D.L. Johnson had published his book, The World Agriculture in Disarray, and the Kruger, Schiff, and Valdez report had come out of the World Bank showing that basically rich countries were subsidizing agriculture, dumping their surpluses on global markets. And poor countries were hurting their own farmers by taxing either through trade policies or through overvalued exchange rates. Afterwards, agriculture was integrated in the GATT, later the WTO, and this in turn triggered important policy reforms, both in WTO members, but also I think in developing countries, a lot of things change. And so today, I think the WTO is much less visible. I'm sure we hear about that in the global food discussions, but also we talk much more about standards, sustainability criteria, climate change affect nutrition than we used to do in 30 or 25 years ago. Clearly, the world has changed, growth of emerging countries. And I was always told, I was much younger than that, really the way trade deals were done in the 1980s was that the EU and the US went into a room, came out with hopefully an agreement, and then the rest signed off, and that was it. And maybe it was Joe Glauber and Pascal Lamy who were together in the room for some of these. Clearly, that's no longer true. So I think that's long enough as introduction. I think Pascal Lamy not only lived through this period, but he was actually in the midst of it as EU Trade Commissioner, as Director General of the WTO. He continues to be very active in a number of areas. I mean, I don't know anybody who is supposed to be retired is still involved in so many different organizations. He is the leader of the Paris Peace Forum, coordination of the Jacques Delors Institute, among many other things. So I very much look forward, Pascal, to your presentation and to the panel afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jo. We have Marcus Noland also to greet us here. Marcus is the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute.
Good afternoon. My name is Marcus Noland. I am the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It is a distinct honor and a pleasure to help open this special event on understanding the new dynamics of agri-food trade, co-hosted with IFPRI and PIIE. At one time in my life, I had an affiliation with IFPRI, so this is actually a homecoming of sorts for me, although at that time, IFPRI was in a different building. At PIIE, we are doing considerable work on trade policy and the trade system between now and November under the rubric Election 2024 Assessing Presidential Economic Platforms. We recently put out a piece by Mary Lovely, who will be appearing on the panel, and her co-author Kim Klausing on the decidedly adverse distributional impact of the presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump's tax and trade proposals. Later this month, Warwick McKibben and I will put out an analysis of the proposal to revoke China's permanent normal trade relations status, an idea with some bipartisan support. Not surprisingly, we find that this proposal is good neither for the US nor China, nor third countries for that matter, even on the criteria that its proponents propose. In the coming months, Warwick and I will also put out a piece addressing Trump's proposal for a 10% global tariff, a 60% tariff on China, the deportation of millions of undocumented workers, and the emasculation of central bank independence. Not surprisingly, our preliminary results suggest that these policies are not beneficial to either the US or its trade partners. We are doing some work on agriculture and food security, most prominently by Alan Wolf, some of that co-authored with Joe Glauber from IFPRI, as well as some work by Jeff Schott. But I think it's fair to say that this has not been the central focus of our activity. In the words of that famous San Francisco police detective, Lieutenant Dirty Harry Callahan, a man has to know his limitations. So I look forward to our discussions, and with that, I am happy to turn the proceedings back over to Charlotte, who will introduce the speaker and moderate the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. So I think Pascal has been introduced already by Jo Swinnen. He serves as our board chair. You heard his other affiliations. And I would just like to add a little personal remembrance, because when I started working on food and ag policies, I was quite young, with the European Commission. and here in Washington, and Pascal Lamy would come into town for negotiations, and sometimes I would feel very fortunate if I got to be in the room when he was talking to Bob Zoellick. And there was a lot of sort of intellectual rivalry between the two of you. And then it was always fascinating because Pascal was such a great strategic defender of the EU position on trade. So fast forward a few years, and then I started working for the International Agri-Food Trade Policy Council. And Pascal Lamy had become the WTO Director General. And I remember thinking at the time, and Sherman and I had this conversation recently, we probably weren't the only ones to say, well, how can a former EU Trade Commissioner take on this job? But he did it beautifully. And he really, even though he had been such a staunch defender of EU policies, he became truly an internationalist. And I think we should remember that today, because the focus here at IFPRI is always on low and middle income countries. So your talk today, Pascal, will really talk about the trade issues from the perspective of developing countries. So over to you. We're really looking forward to your remarks.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Let me also thank both my good friends at IFPRI and at the Peterson Institute for organizing this event about new dynamics, if any, of international agri-food trade. At its core, international agri-food trade is basically a transmission belt between supply and demand, as it is in other areas of the economy, manufacturers, services. It's an important feature of the global economy. Roughly 1 on 5 calories consumed cross a border, and roughly 1.5 billion people on this planet depend on trade to get their food. But it's also a specific kind of international trade, because it matters more than others, because of the deeply human dimension and welfare dimension of food. For lots of people, getting food is the most important part of their life and sometimes of their survival. And this is not the case in manufacturers or services. And second, and I will not enter into details, it's also true that the benefits of international division of labor in agriculture and food do not work the same way as they do on manufacturers. There are limitations about the mobility of capital or about the importance of weather and so on. And again, we're not here to do any theory, but it's also true that it's a specific element of international trade. Now, what shapes international agri-food trade is, of course, demand, supply, and we could spend a lot of time retailing why demand and how it shapes trade, why supply and how it shapes trade. We don't have the time to do that. Let me just mention that, of course, between supply and demand, you have trade obstacles or frictions or trade enablers. Among what are usually and rightly, in my view, considered as trade obstacles are a series of public policy measures, which I will list in my view, trade distorting, decreasing order, starting with export restrictions, and I'll come back to that, then import tariffs, then budget support, which, depending on modalities, can be more or less trade distortive. We have clearly heavily trade distorting part of support to agricultural production, and others which are less than that. But we also need to factor in, when we talk about agri-food trade, a whole series of factors like supply chains, like logistics, like the existence or not of a cold chain, which of course matter a lot given that part of what is traded under the form of commodities is perishable and then has a specific feature which, again, usually manufacturers or services do not have. Now, looking at past and present patterns of international agri-food trade, I think it's fair to say that trade is doing the job. Trade is serving its purpose to bring food where needed, and the relationship between supply and demand has been overall a good one. Volumes have increased quite consistently during the last 20 years, roughly 3% per year. This is how supply matched the increase in demand. The part of food produced which is traded has increased, roughly 15% 20 years ago, roughly 23-25% now. Not that all commodities are traded in the same way. We all know that some are heavily traded, like soybeans. Others are much less traded than rice. Again, let's not enter into details. But this is working. We've had two formidable tests of resilience of international trade in recent times, unfortunately. One is COVID and the other is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In both cases, overall, the international agri-food system has matched the challenge. Of course, prices play their role. They are now on an upward trend, which in a way is good for producers, less good for consumers, but overall it has worked, and the reasons why prices have gone up do not lie a lot between mismatch between what would be supply and demand, but for other reasons. And if you look at trade measures, overall, trade measures have facilitated trade rather than obstructing it. Tariffs have gone down. And one of the reasons why tariff has gone down is that the price of food has gone up and that a number of governments, because of the growing urbanization of their population, decreases import tariffs in order to keep the price of food rather low. In budget terms, the old times which Jo was mentioning, where US and EU were both fighting and calling the shots, are over. When you look at the OECD measurement of aggregate support, it's now roughly 1/3 for the big shots, were the big shots, and 2/3 for those who are now the biggest shot in this area, i.e. China and India. And by the way, you can see the same evolution on the evolution of public stock holdings, which have grown up very significantly, which may be also part of the reason why more resilience. One feature which has appeared in recent times and which may be a problem for the future is a higher concentration of trade flows. 5 countries are at the origin of 70% of agri-food exports today. This is more than in the past, and this is an issue which needs to be seriously considered, in my view. So overall, trade has served its purpose. When we look at future trends, like the ones the OECD have identified for 2020, 2030, it seems that it will be the same, of course, with less growth of volumes, because economies will grow less than they did during the past 20 years, and because demographic conditions will also play their role. But of course, this vision that because it worked well, it's now going to work well, is all things equal. But all things are not equal. And I think there are a series of major challenges which are already there and which could seriously affect the way agri-food trade works, hence have negative consequences on the way it serves its purpose, and notably for the poorest part of the world's population. What are these main challenges as I see them? Issues of increasing importance which may affect trade openness. Three broad categories: food security, environmental sustainability, and health-related precautionary standards. On food security, we all know that this world, unfortunately, is now prone to severe shock that have already and that will affect agricultural production systems, whether climate, whether geopolitical tensions and wars like the one we presently have in Ukraine. And this triggers the risk, which has happened, of negative trade measures, starting with export restrictions, whether in the form of export taxes or in the form of quantitative restrictions to export. This is, in my view, the main danger in the geopolitical and climate situation, which we now have to cope with. As we know, the feeding of part of the population on this planet is worse than it was a few years ago. We roughly have 300 million people on this planet who are undernourished, and among these 300, probably 60 or 80 million are in critical, urgent need of food. This is a lot. This is more than it used to be, and this is a big problem. Of course, Africa is the front line. This is the place, not equally in every part of Africa, and we know that when we talk about Africa, we sometimes forget we talk about 50 or more different countries, but this is really the place, the area with the highest dependency on imports and the higher vulnerability for a number of reasons. This is the problem of food security, and it is a major threat. I totally discount the important narrative which we have in the North about food sovereignty. A fortnight ago, I was summoned to go and testify before the French Parliament, and I had to swear that I would say the truth and only the truth and all the truth. And the title of the inquiry committee which summoned me was, "Why has France lost its food sovereignty?" A joke. Unfortunately, I wasn't called because it is a joke. I was called by people who more or less sincerely believe it is a big problem. And this narrative, I think, is also part of the dangers we have to confront, because as we all know, at least I think and I hope we all know, your food sovereignty may be my food insecurity, and the other way around. And this is what really matters. What really matters is not food sovereignty. What really matters is food security. Now, going to environmental sustainability, this is, again, not a totally new one, but it is the one that is going to play a major role, not least because of the environmental footprint of food production, whether on greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 25% of the total, or on its impact on biodiversity. This needs to change. it will change. It has started to change. And what we've seen is the beginning of a series of environment-related trade measures, not just on food, also on manufacturers, that stem from the fact that whereas we've all decided together to go to zero emissions, we've decided to do that in a national-centered way. One of the big differences between the WTO and the Paris Agreement in that in the WTO you have no target but multilaterally determined contributions. In the Paris Agreement you have one target but you have nationally determined contributions, which is in the name itself a sort of negation of any serious global governance. Hence, what I believed from the beginning and I wrote would probably happen, and which is happening, which is trade frictions. The moment, and I'll come back to that, you address the problem through border measures, then you enter into a series of problems, mostly on the north-south axis, not only, but mostly. The Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels, which is one of those I coordinate in Europe, has abundantly written, including with my signature on this. And we know that for the moment, on the EU side, there is a trade environment nexus instead of a trade environment development nexus. And this is the way things have happened so far. I'm, and a few others, deeply advocating that we should go back to a consideration of the development dimension, but this is extremely low while generating frictions like, and maybe Marine Pangansu will want to talk about this, like this recent dispute on palm oil between Indonesia and the EU, which has given rise to a very interesting and very balanced decision by the part of the dispute settlement which the US have not yet succeeded in paralyzing. So this is one field of clear threats on the openness of international trade. Deforestation directive, carbon border adjustment mechanism, which for the moment is not about food, but which I'm personally convinced, now that the CBAM has opened the way to border measures which are environmentally motivated, there's probably something of this kind cooking somewhere in the European Commission. Finally, a word on the health standards, on which the IFPRI just produced a formidable, as every year, global food trade policy research. I believe that in this area, we are in for a rising level of precaution. I do not see any other direction of travel than more precaution, sanitary, phytosanitary, diet, health standards, and of course, if this is not properly coordinated at international level, and let's be frank, it is not properly coordinated, then addressing these differences, leveling whatever playing field in this area creates serious border issues, starting with the definition of what is green stuff. So if I pull this audience, just the physical one, not the online one today, on one question, what is green stuff, I'll probably get a very wide range of concepts and questions depending on where you come from. So those are, I believe, the main challenges, not the only ones. Now, let's look a bit forward. Do we need new policies, new instruments, new trade agreements in order to cope with these new challenges? I believe so. starting, of course, with the green part of the equation. Do we need carrots or do we need sticks? For the moment, what we've seen happening is more sticks than carrots. Some of you, including Joe and his Peterson Institute pals, have abundantly written about the necessity to, quote unquote, repurpose agricultural support, stemming from a theoretical consideration which I share, which is that properly devised domestic support is better than implementing border measures. That's the theory. The reality today is that border measures have taken the upper hand on any sort of repurposing of agricultural support. There is, as we know, a huge immobility, inertia in all international organizations to address this problem. One of the issues, and again, we don't have time to enter into details, but we might do that in the following part of this afternoon's conversation, starting with a huge issue of methodology. And this is where, by the way, I may have a bit of difference with Joe for once, which is that when it's about repurposing agricultural support, the right number is not the 680 billion of the OECD measurement of agricultural support, which is monkey money. It's not money. It's the way to calculate support with a bit of subsidy, a bit of tariff, and on prices which date from, if my memory is correct, the end of the 1980s, which creates a totally impossible conversation if you want to base your conversation on real numbers, which, when you talk about trade, I would generally recommend. Of course, this raises major problems, including if the border measures are to prevail, problems of, again, methodology, comparability, compatibility, and we have in this Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels proposed to entrust the WTO, Trade and Environment Committee, to provide for a place, a platform where these sort of measures can be notified, discussed. A first stage of comparability, trying to move at a second stage to some sort of a compatibility. On food security, and again, IFPRI produced a very good report last year, advocating for better prediction, better preparation, better resilience. I think what we need is to develop new, clearer criteria, i.e. new disciplines for export restrictions or for public stockholdings. And we know there is a part of the conversation at the WTO today about this, but which, in my view, is a bit biased because of the specific situation of India, but that's a personal opinion. But I think this is something that needs to be open. We need to reopen the food security part of the agricultural agreements. And we also need, in my view, to put more attention on this issue of standards, sanitary, phytosanitary, health, not least, and I'll come back to that just before I conclude, not least because it's not as if all these standards were public. Most of what matters today for an average developing country producer exporting to a rich northern market is not public standards, it's private standards. It's the one that companies compete on, sort of greener or safer than the shop the other side of the street. And this is an element which I think we deeply now need to factor in. And I'm quite attracted by these notions that notably the WWF has tried to promote, to switch from a sort of codex alimentarius, which is a very dotted bit of how to do that to something which would be more like a codex planetarius, which would be much more exhaustive and much more related to climate. One observation before I recommend 2 or 3 axes for IFPRI. After all, this is also part of my job, even in public. Not all this is a global problem. There is a huge part of the solutions to the problems I tried to rapidly mention, which lie in proper domestic policies, national adaptation plans about climate, for instance. So let's, in the way we consider it, always keep a large chunk of what we recommend should be done at local and national level. A few ideas for next IFPRI research priority, you and colleagues, if I may. One is this issue of market concentration. I think we should look at that seriously, because if it keeps going in this direction, this is a threat to resilience. Concentrated markets are less shock resistant, and I believe, unfortunately, that we will have more of these shocks, not least as the chair of the Climate Overshoot Commission. Second, I think we should look afresh to the issues of price formation. What we've seen in recent years, and we had not seen before, is that an increase in the price of commodities leads to a multiple increase of the price of food. This relationship is not, in my view, what it was to be. I don't clearly know why, nor understand why, but I think this is something that matters insofar as the affordability of food is, of course, a great part of food security. Third is this respective importance of public and private standards on health and SPS-related parameters, which, as I said, are now equally, if not more, constraining producers. And I think on this, there is something to be done at global policy level. Some small organizations like the International Trade Center, I think, have done a good job in the last decade or so to move exports of developing countries in this direction. But I don't think they have the sort of necessary theoretical operational approach. And finally, of course, and I will repeat this many times when I discuss with my colleagues on the board of IFPRI, Africa. Africa. I'm not surprised that within the CGIAR there is more attention to this continent than to others. It's not that it's the only one that has severe problems, but when you look 10, 20, 30 years from now, this, I think, needs to remain the absolute priority. I'm not saying this because I'm a European. I have very good reason as a European to believe that Africa needs to become a priority. And I've been saying that in many instances and occasions to my colleagues in Brussels. But I think this is an area where it's absolutely fundamental. So to conclude, looking ahead, I think we are now faced with a more complex equation in order to properly run food systems and the transmission belt of trade. There are growing and possibly conflicting demands on food systems, and countries will inevitably, if there is not enough coordination or work on proper policy recommendations, resort to negative trade policy measures. And I think whether CGIAR, whether IFPRI, whether the Peterson Institute, there is still a huge benefit in investing in proper research, in proper data, to ensure that these policy choices,
Thank you very much, Pascal, for that tour de force. I suggest now that we bring in our first panelist, who is our only participant joining us virtually, and then we can have everybody sit up front, all the speakers, and we'll have a conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marie Pengestu. Marie, can you see you on the screen? Marie, right now, is a distinguished visiting fellow with the Peterson Institute. She was formerly the managing director of development policy and partnerships at the World Bank, and of course also served as the Minister of Trade for Indonesia from 2004 to 2011. That's just a few of her past experiences. We're really delighted to have you with us, Mary. I see that your focus at the Peterson Institute is to look at the challenges inherent in the current international order for developing countries. So I think that fits very well with what we would like for you to talk about today. If you look at the mega trends that Pascal has outlined, how do you see the impact of these on developing countries and those countries' outlooks on trade? Over to you, Mary. Thanks very much.
Okay, can you hear me? I suppose so. Good afternoon, everyone. It's early in the morning here for me, but I wouldn't miss this session, given that it's Pascal, my old friend, giving the talk, and everybody participating are all friends and colleagues. And of course, you didn't mention in your introduction my relationship with IFPRI. So it's good to be back in an IFPRI session. Let me just briefly respond to some of the points Pascal has raised. I think, first of all, on the food insecurity issue, I think we need to also see how climate change itself has impacted on food security. When I was at the bank, of course, we experienced the food insecurity issue with the COVID-19, as well as with the conflict in Russia, and so on. And so the three main drivers of food insecurity, besides the economic shocks, is climate change, conflict, and COVID-19, which was compounding all these crises. So I do think that addressing the food insecurity issue must also mean addressing the climate change issues that are related to the food insecurity. 34 countries with high climate vulnerabilities and high food insecurity are also the ones that are heavily relying on the imports of food. So I think this is the issue, and this is really affecting the sub-Saharan African countries more than any other part of the world, as well as some parts of North Africa and the Middle East. So I think we have to put that context in the picture. And Pascal mentioned the issue about greenhouse gas emissions coming from food production. So on one hand, climate change affects food insecurity, but the food production is also contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. When we are in the climate discussions, we often focus on fossil fuels just because of the CO2 emission that is related to the coal production and so on. But in fact, if you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions with methane and nitrous oxide, food production actually, as we all know, emits more than fossil fuels. And so I do think this leads to his point about national policy, that we have seen increased production because of increased land use and deforestation and so on. And this is the background to the EU policy vis-a-vis palm oil, for instance, and also unsustainable agriculture practices. So I do think from a developing country perspective that we do also need to focus on how we can help developing countries come up with national solutions on a sustainable production in agriculture. And this is about land use, it's about how do you use technology, inputs, seeds, and this is where CGIAR obviously plays a role. Less water, less fertilizer and pesticides, better seeds. And I just give you a good example that I experienced during the time I was at the World Bank. Vietnam has been able to produce low carbon rice that is higher yield, less water, less seeds, better seeds from IFPRI, one of the CGIAR outfits, and be able to improve the incomes and livelihoods for the farmers. So I think these are the kind of issues that we have to also focus on in developing countries. Now let me focus on the trade policy issues that Pascal has raised. I totally agree on the discipline on export restrictions, and it is related to the food sovereignty that he mentioned. You know, I lived through the 2008 food crisis as a trade minister, and I lived through the recent food crisis sitting in the World Bank. So we have all seen how trade restrictions have led to multiples of shocks on the price side, and it hurts the poorest and most vulnerable countries the most. And I think we have to continue on this the discipline that came out in the G20 emergency measures. There were principles introduced, which were the same principles that we talked about in 2008, which was transparency. It has to be measured. It has to be there has to be a sunset clause, and it has to be well targeted. And I think these are disciplines that need to be somehow or other made more binding in the WTO. As we all know, they were there, but there was no enforcement. It was more peer pressure, and G20 and WTO putting some pressure on it. But nevertheless, it is still going to be an issue moving forward. So let me just close with two other points, knowing that we have other speakers that are going to speak. Let me just mention the issue that Pascal talked about the kind of this trade and environment nexus instead of a trade development nexus. And we are experiencing this with, for instance, as an example, the palm oil example, the land use on palm oil, which in the recent case that was undertaken by both Malaysia and Indonesia, brought it to the WTO dispute settlement. And even though there was mixed result, at least there was a recognition that the EU argument was perceived to be weak, and that how they evaluated the land use was not updated, and most importantly that the dissenting panelists said that why are you just focusing on palm oil and not other biofuels? So I think this is going to be ongoing, and I do think that the issue of trade and environment and development needs to be discussed at the WTO, and there has to be more participation by developing countries to determine the outcome of this. And Pascal, you will well remember how we all started this discussion back in 2007 when we held the first informal trade ministers meeting to talk about climate change and environment on the sidelines of the COP that was hosted in Bali in 2007. We're a long way from there, but we're still also a long way from being able to find a solution for trade, environment, and trade and development. Just a final point on national policies. I do think we have to really focus our attention on this, because a lot of developing countries are also falling into the food sovereignty trap, in the sense of going back to using trade restrictions to make sure that you have enough food at home, as well as to protect your farmers. And it is leading to higher prices and less productivity, and also unsustainable food production. And I would hope that IFPRI can come up with good policy recommendations that will give you the triple win. I think we have to come up with good triple wins: increasing the livelihood of farmers, stabilizing the food prices, and coming up with also the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I know that IFPRI and the World Bank have been strong proponents of repurposing fertilizer subsidy, and that's a good argument for governments that they can repurpose their fertilizer subsidy and get this triple win. Because I do think a lot of the policies we're seeing, including in my own country, is going in the wrong direction. So thank you. Hopefully I've been able to add to the discussion. It's a little bit hard to be coherent at 1 a.m. in the morning.
Thank you very much, Marie, and we will excuse you if you get tired, but we really appreciate your comments. Thank you very, very much. Pascal, why don't you join us up here as well? So we're going to keep going with our panel here. And next up is Mary Lovely. She is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. And in 2022, she served as the Carnegie Chair in U.S.-China relations with the Klug Center at the Library of Congress. And she's also a professor emeritus of economics at Syracuse University. Mary, you're going to talk to us today about something that I think Pascal didn't touch on that much, but on the sort of what is happening on the bilateral and regional trade agreements side, given, I think, the lack of substantive progress in multilateral trade negotiations. And then given your great expertise on China, this is, I guess, related, but also a separate question. What role do you see China playing in these agreements, and how do you assess China's push for self-sufficiency in food?
Okay, I think this is on, yeah? Thank you, Charlotte. So you can see I got the easy questions. I think I'll reverse it. Oh, okay, push. Perfect, okay, thank you. I'm gonna reverse it and talk first about the US-China relationship, which is, as Charlotte mentioned, my area of study. And then come back and talk about what impact the current tensions have on the agri-food trade. So I think that we know that post-war trade agreements have greatly improved access to overseas markets for countries. Since 2000, in nominal terms, global exports of agricultural food have increased by 450%. Today, I think the U.S.-China trade conflict, I'll call it a conflict, not just tensions anymore, disrupts, I think, global ag trade. It changes bilateral trade flows, flows from third countries, and country priorities. So I'll try to make that case. So U.S. agricultural exports are important to the United States. The USDA forecasts that U.S. agricultural exports in fiscal 2024 are going to be about $171 billion. We have higher exports in mostly all products, but especially livestock and dairy. Agricultural imports are important to China. China is the world's largest importer of food. In 2023, its total food import value reached $139.6 billion, which is very close to the actual total of what the U.S. exports. The country imports various food items, with soybeans a particularly important commodity for China. Additionally, China is a major importer of wheat, corn, and rice. My third point, the U.S.-China bilateral relationship is important to agriculture. Now, why? Well, the U.S. accounts for more than 10% of world farm trade, and China is the largest importer. If we look at products, the importance of the relationship is obvious. In animal products, the largest exporter is the United States. The largest importer is the People's Republic of China. If we look at vegetable products, the largest exporter is the U.S. The largest importer is the People's Republic of China. So these two giants are important not just in manufacturing trade, which we hear about all the time, but also in agricultural trade. U.S.-China agricultural trade, the bilateral relationship, is declining. Because agricultural exports are only about 8% of total merchandise exports in the United States, we may discount the effect of disruptions in agricultural trade to the United States. During the U.S.-China trade war, we saw the importance of agricultural trade to the United States because China retaliated against the U.S. tariffs on China manufactured goods by placing tariffs on almost 100% of U.S. exports of agricultural goods to China. This was highly disruptive within the United States to the extent that former President Trump felt the need to ameliorate the situation for American farmers, and almost all of the trade war tariff revenue was used to support farmers who were affected by Chinese retaliation. It obviously clearly also affected Chinese consumers who experienced shortages and higher prices and less variety. The effect of the trade war is long-lasting. It's really has never gone away. In 2021, Brazil replaced the United States as China's largest agricultural supplier. Today supplies 20% of China's agricultural imports. So at a minimum, it rearranged the deck chairs. Compared with last year, so far U.S. soybean and corn volume shipments to China are down 23% and 67% respectively, while Brazil's shipments of these commodities have surged. So we've seen a permanent rearrangement of the trade flows within this triad. China is projected to fall below Mexico and China to become the third largest U.S. agricultural market. This is over a very short period of time. So trade in agriculture seems like an obvious way to improve food security, but it's not how it's talked about in the relationship. It's thought about as a source of food, of insecurity, not of security. So each country sees self-sufficiency as a key to economic security. We see this in the United States most strongly in semiconductors, but greater self-sufficiency through trade restrictions and barriers may actually harm economic resilience. A good example is the African swine flu outbreak in China, which led to a substantial decline in domestic pork production, higher pork prices, and increased reliance on pork imports. But without trade, the situation would have been far worse. Even though it is the world's largest food exporter, the United States has also experienced a food crisis. We don't think it happens here, but it can. And imports were used to reduce the harm. And I refer here particularly to the baby formula crisis, where nationwide out-of-stock rates surged to 70% in May of 2022. I think many of us have forgotten how dire that situation was for many parents and what a political hot potato it became very quickly, just as pork prices are important to political stability in China. Now, in China, they're deeply concerned that the country's food sufficiency ratio has decreased, where it's now about 66%. So they produce about 66% of the food that they need. And there are many reasons that don't have to do with negative things about why imports have increased. One is a reduction in China's arable land supply for a variety of reasons. Secondly is consumers who are deeply concerned about food safety. China's had some really shocking food safety problems. Thirdly would be changing diets and tastes of Chinese urban consumers who prefer imported food. And lastly, the fact that imports provide lower prices, and so consumers may prefer it. Obviously, food imports can provide more supply, more variety, better quality, and lower prices, and yet nonetheless they are being rejected. President Xi Jinping aims to achieve self-sufficiency in food with an emphasis on improving domestic supply, although he also has some policies designed to better use the existing supply, such as reducing food waste. Besides stockpiling, the country is working to increase high-quality arable land, enhance seed production, and improve farming efficiency. When we look particularly at trade, both countries are turning to regional solutions and friendly partners. And here I come to the second part, which is China is looking not just to Brazil, it's also looking to improve and increase its imports from all Belt and Road Initiative countries. So it's very similar to the U.S. approach, which is to look for friendshoring in a way. And the U.S. government also is doing this. As you had seen from earlier, Mexico and China are now our biggest customers, and we have opportunities, we'll see if we take them, at the 6-year review of the USMCA to solve some of the existing agri-trade disputes that continue, particularly in corn and dairy trade. So I'll leave it
Mary.
there.
Great. Those are great points, and hopefully we'll have some more time in Q&A. But let's get to some of the other panelists here. So next up is Annabelle Gonzalez. Annabelle, it's great to have you with us. You are on leave from the Peterson Institute right now, also serving as a vice president for countries at the IDB. Also a former trade minister from Costa Rica, and of course you also served as the Deputy Director General at the WTO. So Pascal, I think, has made it very clear that the ag negotiations have been a tough slog, and some argue that this is because the system is in need of reforms, obviously. Do you agree with that assessment? And which reforms do you think are going to be the most crucial to sort of revitalize the WTO?
So thank you very much, Charlotte. I'm delighted to be here to talk about this topic. The short answer to your question is I do agree that the WTO needs reform. And I think that it needs reform, or let me phrase my response at 2 levels. One is it needs reform in all of its functions. And of course, agricultural negotiations are not are impacted by the need for reform in these 3 functions. And this means in the negotiating function, it needs to move towards more flexible negotiating approaches. For example, plurilateral negotiations, and there is important work in that regard. Second, it needs to reform its dispute settlement function to make sure that it can have a more effective and fully functional dispute settlement mechanism. And third, it needs to strengthen its monitoring and deliberation function, among others, to deal with some of the issues that Pascal was mentioning, and I'll come back a little bit to that. So that's one dimension. The second dimension of reform is, of course, to the agreement on agriculture, because this agreement was negotiated 30 years ago when the world was very different. For example, there is no mention in the agreement on agriculture of the world climate change. And I think this shows, of course, how different it is the world today. Now, members knew this. It was clear, I guess, since the agreement was negotiated that this was not a perfect instrument, and they included a built-in mandate to continue negotiations. Now, even as there have been a few outcomes in ministerial conferences, the reality is, of course, that the reform of the agreement on agriculture has proven elusive. And, there was no decision on agriculture, on the core negotiating agricultural issues at the previous ministerial conference, MC12, and there was no decision on agriculture in the most recent ministerial conference, MC13 in Abu Dhabi earlier this year. Most recently, the major roadblocks in this negotiations has been the issue of the permanent solution for the issue of public stock holding for food security purposes, something that we can discuss later a bit in more detail. But for all the challenges, what I find very interesting is that members are persevering. WTO members are persevering, and they continue to try to find ways to bring new or fresh approaches to the negotiation. And I think this is for several reasons. One is they recognize the need to address old issues, some of them which have been there for a long time, but also to address some of the newer issues that Pascal was making reference to. And the second reason I think why they persevere is because in reality for agriculture, there's no other real forum for negotiation. For some of these topics, when you think about domestic support, well, domestic support will not get new disciplines or revised disciplines elsewhere. So members really need to think about how to tackle these issues in the WTO. More recently, I was in Geneva earlier this week, and there's a lot of discussion going on about a proposal by Brazil to take the latest draft that was tabled in Abu Dhabi at MC13 to try to begin a conversation about developing modalities for agriculture. This, I think, is interesting because the last time that modalities were developed, well, Pascal Lamy was the Director General of the WTO, and I'm going to share something with you. I was the Director of Agriculture at the WTO at the time. So this was some time ago. Now, we will see whether that gathers traction or not, but there's a big push going on in that regard. So the final thing I want to say is that even if it's not a substitute for negotiations, valuable work goes on in the WTO at the committee level. And I'm going to put a couple of examples here. One is on the issue of specific trade, what are called specific trade concerns, which is concerns that members may have about policies of measures of other members impacting their trade. And there is, I can tell you, no single most discussed topic today than the EU deforestation regulation and the impact that that can have on developing countries. And that is happening at the Committee on Agriculture, at the Committee on TBT, on SPS, Council on Trading Goods, every committee in the WTO. And I think this may eventually have an impact, at least in terms of gaining a bit more time for implementation of this regulation. The other example that I wanted to put is that in the Committee of Agriculture, just recently in April, they also adopted a decision on more transparency on export restrictions that may impact least developed countries and net food importing developing countries. So this is to say that negotiations, very challenging, members persevere, but still important discussions, important conversations going on at the committee level.
Great. Thank you very much, Annabelle. If everybody's okay, we're going to go till about 4:15 since we started late. So we have two more presenters, and then we're eager to open up to a Q&A. So we turn next to Joe, and I think the stage has been set really well for your topics, Joe. Joe is a senior research fellow here at IFPRI. He's had a very distinguished career at USDA. He served as the chief economist from 2008 to 2014. And he also was the special DOA agricultural envoy at USTR, served as the chief agricultural negotiator in the DOA talks. So yes, had plenty of opportunity, I think, to see many of the people here on the panel. Joe, the speakers have touched a little bit on the issues arising around domestic measures taken in the name of food security. So maybe you could talk a little bit more on those, and in particular the export restrictions, food reserves, and domestic support. And I don't know if Will Martin is in the room, but maybe you know his recent work, which I think is really interesting on export restrictions, where he essentially says it's not just that countries that impose export restrictions are hurting other countries, they're actually also hurting themselves. So over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And yes, I I have the scars from being around in 2007 and 8, and also was in the back room in 1992 with, at the time, Ray McSherry and Guy Legras, I guess, when the Uruguay round was being finalized. But let me address three challenges I think that Pascal lays out. And first of all, thanks for the invitation to be on here, particularly with all you guys. This is I'm honored. But let me first start with export restrictions. I think, everyone's talked about over the last 15 years. We saw them during the food price crisis in 2007-8, COVID, some during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And more recently, India has export restrictions on 3 major commodities right now: rice, sugar, and onions, which are having major impacts on those markets and market prices. I think there was good progress made in MC12, at least to prohibit export restrictions that affect humanitarian aid. But I think, and I think that it may make a lot of sense to extend those to exports destined for LDCs and net food importing countries. But at the end of the day, export restrictions raise prices, and that affects even those exports that aren't directly affected by those restrictions. And I think that's a problem. I think Mari's point about, or mentioning of the G20 and those measures that they've proposed, those are all well and good. They should be discussed in the WTO, but it continues to be a problem. Second, public stockholding. That has remained an obstacle. It really wasn't much of a problem in 2007-8. I mean, this really arose because prices took off during that period, and all of a sudden, these base periods that were used to calculate support from 1986 to 88 were totally outdated. The technical fix, I think, is pretty easy in theory. That is, you could update the base period, and that would make the calculation of market price support being much more reasonable. I think the more difficult question is whether market price support for public stockholding programs should remain actionable. That is, if they're found to distort production, trade, and prices. Some have argued that they shouldn't. They should just be exempt because they're public stockholding programs. That, I think, does remain an issue. I think for LDCs and net food importing developing countries with negligible export interests, this may be a consideration, and I think that a consideration that many could sign on to. But it becomes far more problematic when the country's a large exporter. I mean, India, for example, accounts for 40% of global rice exports, and that's a very different kettle of fish or kettle of rice. And then lastly, and I think this is I think actually, Pascal, I agree with you a lot on your comments on repurposing. Repurposing really is the new buzzword. People talk about reprogramming, trade distorting domestic support to promote, to enhance nutrition, reduce greenhouse gases, and promote other public goods. The problem is that least developed countries have very little fiscal support to repurpose. So it's one thing to talk about the U.S. taking the $20–30 billion annually, or $20 billion annually that we pay that goes into farm programs, and say, okay, we'll put that into more conservation programs or climate-based programs. It's very different to say, okay, well, what can Malawi do, or what can Botswana do, or what countries with a lot less money to be able to do that. And as Pascal points out, most of the support that is provided by those countries is through border measures. And so, yes, you could reduce border measures, but that's a very imperfect way of trying to promote public goods. I think the question is there a way to provide incentives for developed countries to repurpose trade distorting support to meet the needs of least developed countries or lesser developed countries? And I think there you could envision sort of increasing research and development to boost productivity for so-called orphan crops, crops that aren't getting very much direct support right now. I mean, most of the research monies go to the big commercial grains like corn and wheat and soybeans and to a limited into rice. But think about teff, or think about millets and sorghum. There's huge amounts of progress could be made in reducing transportation costs, improving trade facilitation. I think the interesting thing to me is to think about some way that you could give offsets or something to developed countries to reduce developed countries that are trying to reduce domestic support commitments. Is there a way that you could give some sort of credit for providing the right sort of incentives? Not the least, this obviously would be controversial, and I think a lot would depend on how you could think about it. But just in trying to, right now, the way these things like research development and other sorts of expenditures are considered, they're green box and they're exempt from reduction commitments. But there's no real incentives to provide that. So could we think of a way like that that might be able to do it? And lastly, I would just agree with, I think, a point that many of the panel have made, that these are issues that really need to be addressed in a multilateral context because they transcend the typical trading that goes on in a bilateral context where it's largely about border measures or largely about factors that affect either country, but less so more generally. So you're thinking about standards and things like that. That can only be addressed in the WTO successfully, because I think otherwise you're going to end up with the classic Bhagwati spaghetti bowl of a lot of different standards that are just going to be burdens for least developed countries and others. With that, I'll stop. Now I'm not sure that one's
Okay,
working.
that one seems to be great. Thank you very much, Joe. Sherman, you wear two hats here at the same time. Some of the speakers have gone back and forth between IFPRI, World Bank, and Peterson Institute. You do both. You're a research fellow emeritus here at IFPRI and a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson. Of course, former director of the Trade and Macroeconomics Division and a leading expert on global and national economic simulation models. You're going to round off this panel by talking, I think, about the work that Mark has already referred to in his opening, looking at the U.S. election and possible outcomes for U.S. trade policy and, by extension, global trade.
Just a quick point. The second, is it on?
Yeah, now
Yeah. Everything we've looked at on climate change and the global model has been working for years are an absolute complete agreement that there's going to be an increasing role for international trade in agriculture as we go forward. It's going to be more important looking as far forward as we can look. So that's one environment. Mark Nolan mentioned this work program at Peterson looking at what happens in a world where the U.S. basically goes protectionist, and that's what we're seeing. You had trade wars under Trump. You haven't turned them off under Biden. Trump actively sabotaged the WTO. Biden is, I think the U.S. could be charitably described as not present at the WTO in the last 4 years. So that's a problem. I've done a lot of reading in the last 5 years or so with COVID and all on history of the 1930s. It's very interesting and educational to do that because we also had trade wars and then. The difference now is the U.S. it may have a trade war, but the rest of the world is not following. That is not, we are not replaying the 1930s. The U.S. is not doing any trade agreements under Trump nor under Biden at the moment. The rest of the world is doing trade agreements all over the place. There are multilateral agreements in East and Southeast Asia. The EU is running around doing trade agreements everywhere. So the world is moving ahead. And as Annabelle pointed out, the WTO is trying to move ahead. It's difficult in the WTO, and we may well see an environment where, in effect, the U.S. is a non-participant and you start working with pluralities of various kinds at the WTO instead of this unanimity. We will see. Why has it happened like this? Well, if you look post-World War, the U.S. was hegemonic in the world trading system. It was enormous. Then you had the EU. The EU emerged, U.S. sort of had NAFTA. EU emerged and is now roughly the same GDP as the U.S., a little bit higher, a little bit whatever, but it accounts for about 30% of global trade. You then have an integrated economy centered in East and Southeast Asia, with China as one of the anchor countries, and Japan and Korea. Also about 30% of global trade, also about the same GDP as the U.S., and the U.S. has 10% of global trade. So what you're observing, and we've seen it in agriculture, when you do one of these trade wars, the rest of the world is adjusting around the U.S. and doing it pretty easily. And as we project that forward, we can see that continuing. So you may well be in moving forward in a world where basically the U.S. is not present or is withdrawing from it. But that doesn't seem to be necessarily a bad thing in the sense that the rest of the world is perfectly capable of adjusting and moving ahead.
Okay, the floor is open. We've had a very rich and far-ranging discussion. If you would come up to the mic and introduce yourself. We're starting with Anne.
Thank you. I told Pascal that there's not much that gets me out of Silver Spring down to Washington anymore, but the chance to hear you speak certainly was. I wanted to come back on this issue about repurposing because that was something I was quite involved with the just real transition, which kind of got that issue kicked off. And I just want to make 2 points. I hope you heard all of that. I just want to make 2 points about repurposing. So one is that while, yes, Malawi at this point doesn't have the kind of money to be repurposing, we also know that China did not have the kind of money to be spending on its agriculture 10 years ago, but now is one of the biggest subsidizers. So using the framework of repurposing or something similar to prevent countries from moving the wrong direction once they do have the financial means to support their farmers, I think is really quite important. And the other point I would make just sort of as an intellectual basis, what I saw in the shift to this conversation about repurposing was a move from blaming farmers for the problems that agriculture can create, to saying farmers can be part of the solution and can provide global public goods, but need to be paid for that. And that's really a shift in the way we think about what we're doing with our agricultural farm policies and the role that farmers can play. So it's a lot different than where we were at in the Uruguay round, where the idea was just to take the money out of the sector. So I think that's an important point. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Anne. We'll take a few more questions. Maybe on the topic of repurposing, the point was made that many developing countries don't have the resources, don't have the money out there to repurpose, but maybe one exception actually is fertilizer subsidies, because a lot of money is spent on fertilizer subsidies, although I assume some of the donors are also implicitly paying for that. So that to me seems to be an area that is, I mean, we calculate that about 50% of global fertilizer demand is there just because of subsidies. So it's a large amount of money, and it is something that I think is important to look at for many reasons. Please go ahead.
You've spoken about some of the shocks, global shocks, COVID and the Ukraine war that have affected global food trade. You see right now the issues with the Houthis in the Red Sea and the disruptions that they've caused to the trade going through the Red Sea, 15% of global trade and 30% of container trade. This area is also an area where you have the Horn of Africa and Yemen and Saudi Arabia, an area of water scarcity and food insecurity. I really would just like to understand your thoughts. Do you think that there could be potential for economic cooperation, sort of a regional trade agreement in this particular part of the world that might help to mitigate some of the issues currently ongoing? So the question is there potential for trades, a regional trade agreement or regional cooperation in the Red Sea area? Thank you.
Very interesting question. Let's take one more. Jerry Hagstrom.
Hi, Jerry Hagstrom from the Hagstrom Report and National Journal. As we're talking here about China and also talking about the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, I'm wondering if the trade shifts from one country to another, if China's going to buy from Brazil instead of from the U.S., do you care as policymakers, or does that matter, and even if it's for non-economic reasons? And the same thing about the regionalization. Most likely, there would be more trade among the three countries in the USMCA. Is that a good development, or does that violate your principles?
Okay, thanks very much. I'm wondering if, Pascal, maybe you want to take the questions on repurposing or the suggestion. Joe, sorry, you're, I think, perfect for the discussion around the Red Sea. And I think that's a really interesting question, because not only would it be in the interest of those countries, but presumably of the interest of the world for there to be some stability along the Red Sea. And then Mary, and maybe I can turn to you about the question, shifts in trade, do they matter?
Well, on repurposing, I'm extremely interested by the theory and technicalities of this, although I believe this is not going to be a political issue for the times to come. And the main reason for that is that it was a major issue when it was a North-South fight. And the energy we had in the WTO on this was because a number of developing countries were leading the charge against the EU and the US. And they liked it, and it was a real fight. No more of that. When you look at who supports farming today, China is number 1, India is number 2, US is number 3, and EU is number 4. So there's no political energy for that. And the big problem, of course, and this was mentioned by Joe, is that the rest of the developing countries are nowhere on this. Now, the other reason why I believe repurposing in the traditional sense does not have a lot of a future is that farming is more a problem of nature distorting today than supporting farming a problem of trade distortion. There will be no solution to the climate crisis, and I worked on that 20% of my time during 2 years as chair of the Climate Overshoot Commission, without a fundamental change in the way we integrate environmental externalities in our economies. And agriculture is not on the first line, and on this, I don't believe, like Mary Pangetsu, that it's worse than fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is much worse. But this is the real issue. So I think if we look ahead on this, the real problem is how do you properly value nature-based externalities, positive externalities, and I think this is really the way to go on repurposing.
Let me just say one thing also on repurposing. I think the other thing to remember is that agriculture, even in the absence of subsidies, still has huge externalities in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and all that. And we did, in some of the work that Pascal cited, we looked at just removing subsidies, and that actually had fairly minimal impact on those greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. The repurposing does address it, because then you can go and kind of target it. And so I think, Ann, I agree with you on that. The problem, I see the political problem is repurposing the U.S. right now, what it means is giving them climate payments plus safety net payments. So there's not really repurposing. And if anything, the repurposing is taken away from SNAP benefits and giving that to farmers. It's kind of reverse purposing. But let me talk about Houthis, because that was my question. And there, I think it's less a question of a trade agreement as it is. I mean, there you do have a terrorist disruption or a war situation, and whether or not a free trade agreement in the area would be good, I think probably would be, but I don't think that's what the externalities that are currently being created would do much there. But Mary.
Thanks for the question. So with Brazil taking the role of of the United States in China's basket, we might think that we're going to have the so-called immaculate reorganization. I think that's that's deceptive. One, this is a commodity, and so to some extent, a product is a product. When we look at other types of agricultural trade, we might think that that's not true. Secondly, I think we're looking at a situation, and this has been documented more by Gita Gopinath and others at the IMF, which is that trade in blocks is beginning to grow much faster than trade across blocks. And so Sherman spoke, I think, very interestingly and provocatively about the idea that the U.S. will just isolate itself. But the U.S. is so big and so important that we will see the emergence of blocs. And I think for smaller countries, you then have this problem of which bloc do I go to? I don't want to go into either bloc, but if I don't go into this bloc, you know, will I be able to trade? And of course, getting back to the Joe's spaghetti bowl, how am I burdened with all of these different rules, you know, to trade to the U.S. or trade to China? So we have thought a lot in the United States about how to block China from our trade. We haven't thought at all, I think, and I really don't think that's much of an overstatement about what effect that will have on the poorest countries, even the medium income countries who play a very large role in trade.
We have an interesting question that's come in online from Bettina Rudloff from the German Institute of International Security. How do you evaluate the increasingly used narrative of weaponization of food at different perspectives in terms of increasing hunger resulting from sanctions and other trade measures? While we decide who would like to answer that, let's take another couple of questions from the room, please.
Hi, thank you very much for a really interesting and informative panel. I'm David Nelson with Cargill. My question is, there's been a discussion about the need for improved seed technology to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, in the face of growing population. And yet, one of the biggest challenges to global trade in food has been fear of seed technology. Do you see any chance of that being resolved?
Great. Nancy, please.
Thank you, Charlotte. I wanted to ask Annabelle about the dispute resolution reform. What would it consist of? I don't think your mic is on. But shall I just yell? Right there. Yeah, that should do. Right. Well, I don't know if it's working. Is that better? Yes. Doesn't matter. Go for it, Nancy. It's an easy question, maybe. We can hear you. The problem with the dispute resolution mechanism is the U.S. So would the reform somehow change around who gets to be on that setup? I mean, it's a little bit like trying to reform the World Bank and the IMF without you're reforming the U.S. in some cases, or wishing the U.S. would undertake its own reform of the way it handles international issues.
Great. I'm going to add a last question for Annabelle as well. We were going to have you also talk about the importance of the Latin American and Caribbean region in international trade. So I know you've been looking at that extensively. So I think it would be great to also hear from you on that. So who wants to take the quite loaded question on weaponization of food?
For me, it's the same question as the following one on the Franken food. It's mythology. It plays a big role in human history. There is a lot of stories, legends about this, but there is very little evidence, if any, in today's world that food is weaponized in order to put pressure on the country. And I'm struck, including in my own country. I told you about this. I'm testifying before a committee. A bunch of people who really believe France is in danger of not having food because it would be used as a weapon against the country. And I really had a hard time remaining serious because I had to, and I had no choice. So for me, and it's a bit like the question on take and food. I mean, there is such an amount of Gramscian distorted narrative about this that it's very difficult to have a sort of solid reasoning reasoned position on this. So I think, at least for us, on the side of those who can pretend that they help framing public discourse, we'd better really dump a lot these issues, which I don't see as serious ones.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that? No. Okay. So maybe we can. Seed technology has not been accepted. Who would like to take that one? Even though Monsanto is now a German company, are those problems behind us?
It's what the CGIAR does for a living, is develop new and better seeds. What's lurking behind it is the genetic modification issue. And the answer is we've been genetically modifying seeds for a long time. We just know how to do it better. And it is a process of education. You are not going to feed the world by more extensive farming. There's not enough land. So you're going to have to increase yields, and new seeds are a major part of that. And we've been doing a very good job of it for a very long time. And a lot of evidence that we can continue. The general view, I've been involved in a couple of efforts of asking the question, can we feed the world in 2050 or whatever? And the answer seems to be again and again, yes. And it does require serious productivity increases, more intensive farming, and better seeds. And we're working on all three. Right? I gave a talk on one of those studies to the CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies. And the point I made there is it's pretty widespread view among the ag-econ profession is, yes, we can do this. And I said to that audience, you know, if we came out with results that said we don't think we can do this, I thought I would see a lot more military uniforms in the audience than I did at the time.
Annabelle, do you want to address the question about the dispute settlement process, and then on Latin America?
I'll go the other way around because I want to make the link at the end, which is to start by saying that Latin America and the Caribbean is the world's largest net exporter of agri-food products, right? It accounts for about 14% of the value of global agricultural and fisheries production, and its share of world agricultural exports is about 17%. It's the world's main supplier of cereals, oilseeds, sugar, and other products. So this is an important player in terms of global food security, but it's also an important player in terms of addressing environmental issues. With 60% of the world's biodiversity, its forests, its ecosystem services, it's really, it can make a very important contribution to mitigating climate change. But the point, I think, is that it can do more. It can do more to address these twin challenges of food security and the environment. But it is facing a challenging external context. There is, of course, a domestic agenda, and Sherman addressed these issues, productivity, innovation, and others. But the external challenging is very, the external environment is very challenging. It's not only some of these old things that are still there, like tariff escalation, tariff peaks, and things like that, but it's really the new issues that Pascal was mentioning, health regulatory issues, and what there's a very interesting paper from OECD recently, from last year, that talks about the fast and furious rise of environmental impact reporting in food systems. And this really risks fragmenting global markets. And this, even if based on science, on scientific standards, the reality is that reporting standards increase the cost of trade and exclude small-scale producers from the market. So this is one big problem that Latin American countries confront. And of course, then there is the issue of domestic support, because this continues to be an important issue. Most, if not all, countries in the region do not have the fiscal space to replicate what is happening elsewhere. And there's no real effective mechanism either to counter the negative spillovers from some of these measures. So for Latin American Caribbean countries, Again, going back to the point on the WTO, having an organization where these issues can be negotiated, can be sorted out, is very important. And of course, this brings me to Nancy's point about dispute settlement system. An effective dispute settlement system is very important to implement rules. I remember some time ago, I wrote something with Joe about the use of the dispute settlement system by developing countries, by a lot of Latin American countries in the WTO, and these are very active participants in the WTO. Now, the main problem I think that the system confronts right now is this possibility that a report of a panel can be appealed into the void, because then it lacks sort of the force that it had before. Now, members have been working at this. They set 2024 at the date to try to find a solution, and there are many things that are being discussed. Alternative dispute settlement mechanisms that can work. Then there is the question as, do you want to have a two-stage mechanism, or what are the conditions under which this could work? Then it's greater access by developing countries to the mechanism. So there are different aspects that are being considered. I would say that the great majority of countries in the context of the WTO believe that addressing this issue of a fully and effective functioning mechanism is critical to the organization.
Okay, we are already beyond our time limit. I'm going to ask Joe to quickly intervene on China. He wanted to, and then Pascal gets to close us off for today.
Okay, and very, very briefly, I just wanted to have a small nuance to what Mary's excellent response on the China-Brazil issue. I think that one, understand that Brazil's market share in the world has been growing, and that started long before the U.S.-China conflict. In fact, most of the growth for soybean demand, for example, has been China over the last several years, 20 years or so. And it's natural. U.S., as I think as Sherman alluded to, has no, it's not like there's a lot of area to bring into production. Most of the increase in soybeans has largely been to a little bit of changing, switching crops, growing more soybeans, but mainly through yield growth. And so it's very limited in terms of what they can do as compared to Brazil, which has, because of a very intensive crop rotation, double cropping with corn, they can get a lot more production out, and they've been able to meet that. They ship about 7 months during the year to China. The other 5 months, the U.S. takes it. U.S. share has actually dropped over the last couple of years, in particular because domestic demand for subsidized biofuels. Biodiesel production has increased dramatically over the last 2 or 3 years, which means more soybeans are being crushed domestically and not being exported. And when you have a crop like soybeans, which are their dominant export crop to places like China, you take that down, then all of a sudden China falls to number 3. Sorry, Pascal, you're next.
You get to wrap us up.
We are going on the anecdote side, which is good because they're more funny than the rest of the stuff. Two anecdotes. One, on dispute settlement, what's happening today is exactly what Sherman said. We have a dispute settlement system. We have one. The EU won a case against Colombia on the fries. As Mary said, there was a recent, very interesting adjudication on EU-Indonesia palm oil. It's simply we have a system where the US are not there anymore. So it's not a prediction. This is how it's happening today. Second, on the anecdotal side, during a time where Juncker was president of the Commission and Mr. Trump president of the US, there was a big discussion in the White House because Trump wanted to put tariffs on German cars because there are plenty of Mercedes in New York and 0 Chevron in Berlin, which was a real big problem that really needed to be addressed. And then Juncker said, no, don't do that, we can do something for you. "Well," said Trump, "what can you do for it? We can buy more soya beans." He had a brief reading saying that given exactly what Joe was saying, which is that the trade between US and China was moving in such a way that Brazil was now exporting to China, then there was more room for US to export to EU. And it worked. And we traded, and Juncker very cleverly traded an inevitable shift in the way soybean trade would against an absence that time of tariffs on Mercedes. So soybeans can be very useful.
Trade deals are
So we've had an outstanding discussion here. Please join me in thanking our great speakers. There's lots we can continue discussing over coffee. And I did just want to briefly, because it's very related to the topic, we have an event coming up on June 6th, which is looking at tackling the hidden costs of our food system. So that gets to the question of pricing of externalities. So hope all of you can join us for that. Thanks very much for being here. Sorry for the late start and the running over time, but I think it's been a great discussion. Thank you.